Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the second webinar in our Safe on FME series. We had the Bugzilla one with Ian, I think it was 2 weeks ago, and got some really good feedback on it, so we're excited to keep the series going. And I'll introduce you to Ryan. He has hosted a lot of our training courses, so you've probably heard from him before, and I'm super excited to get to work with him because this is actually the first time I get to chat on a webinar.
Yes, I have not done many webinars, many training courses, very few if any actual webinars. So
well, as the webinar wrangler, now you're gonna be on a lot more.
this will be a little different. Usually I'll be asking people to work through stuff with me, but today I actually get, I guess, to talk as fast as I want. So.
Well, yeah, we're trying to crunch a lot of things into 40 minutes, and there's a lot to cover, but I think it'll be really exciting for people to see what you've done because you've done a lot of new creative things yourself, but you've also taken some of our existing workspaces and built on those. So yes, that'll be inspiring for people to see.
Okay, so with that, I think we'll begin. So just a show of hands before we get started, how many of you have taken one of our FME training courses and have used one of our training virtual machines? That's good.
Oh, I forgot to mention, I'm also going to be monitoring the chat and questions panel. So as questions and ideas come to mind, definitely type them into the chat there, and we'll have a Q&A at the end of the webinar and all the way throughout.
Okay. So I see quite a few of you have taken our online training courses. For those of you who haven't, we offer virtual machines during our free training courses. Those virtual machines have installations of FME on them, as well as all of the training data that a student will need during the course. We first started offering our online training courses around 2010. The system we first used had a few downsides. The first is it was expensive. It cost around $2 per hour per student. But that wasn't the real problem. I mean, ultimately, it was still far cheaper for us to offer than our online training courses. The real problem was that changing the software on the virtual machines was difficult. And the company hosting the virtual machines needed at least a week and preferably a month of advance notice. And there was usually pushback from the provider every time we tried to change the disk image used for the virtual machine. And that didn't work well for us. We are usually fine-tuning software and data until just a few days before the course.
This webinar, like we were literally working on the slides
yes,
like right before this.
If it wasn't for the last minute, nothing would get done. I mean, sometimes we are fine-tuning data between sessions of the courses as well, and their system just didn't support that. So we found that using Amazon AWS EC2 instances as virtual machines was, for one, considerably cheaper. It was around 50 cents per hour per student, and it has since dropped down to 12 cents per hour per student. And we could change the disk images as often as we liked, and right up until the moment we started creating virtual machines for the course. But there were a few things to overcome. So we started experimenting with Amazon AWS EC2 machines in late 2010, and we did our first training course using EC2 virtual machines in early 2011. And it was immediately evident that there were things about this setup that we'd want to automate. Ultimately, we've automated some aspects of the creation of the disk images. We've automated the creation of the FME data download, and we've allowed students to request their virtual machines before the course begins. And all of that's being managed ultimately with FME workspaces on FME server. And before I start diving into workspaces, here's some of the all-star transformers that I make extensive use of. You can keep an eye out for. Some of you are probably already familiar with transformers like the creator, the attribute manager, and the logger. We make use of those in our training courses quite a lot. But there are some lesser known transformers that are essential for my work, such as the HTTP caller and HTML extractor, the Python caller, working closely with the JSON flattener, the string searcher, list exploder, attribute file writer, and system caller. You'll rarely see those in a training course, but I make a lot of use of them. Also, I make a lot of use of private parameters, conditional values, partial runs, and the FME server REST API, which is also really important. And I believe we have a REST API course coming up sometime soon.
Yeah, I'll chat that into the link.
I just realized that some of this I wouldn't be able to do without the knowledge I gained from the REST API course.
Yeah, this is good for people with the transformers list. Some pro tips and some pro tips as you do the examples too.
I wanted a way to automate the setup of the training images, known as Amazon Machine Images. Basically, it's kind of like the old ghost images you would have of a drive. It's a template, I guess, for creating your virtual machines for courses and for other uses. I had created a batch file to set up all the applications, and I had placed that on GitHub so that we had an easy way of accessing the batch files, but there were still some hurdles to overcome. The first is the link to the FME data download changed every year. Also, the link to FME desktop and FME server installers changed with every single build, and we release a build every week, every 2 weeks, quite often. The releases are less often, but it's still frequent enough that there'd be things I'd have to edit every time I created an image or tried to update them. Also, the content of FME data, the data set that we use for the training courses, which is maintained on GitHub, changes often. And GitHub limits how much you can download. So we can't have everyone downloading directly from GitHub. So we need to copy our GitHub FME data repository to AWS S3. Now we could do all these things manually, but it's easy to miss steps, even if you have a checklist. And ideally, I'd rather spend time fine-tuning the machines or the data themselves as opposed to maintaining the scripts or maintaining checklists to move things around. Our sample data set that is used for every training course is maintained in GitHub, and this works well for us, but we can't use the download zip option from GitHub for general downloading. There's a limit to how much you can download from GitHub, and with the size of FME data, we hit that limit really quickly. So we wanted to put the zip file onto S3. To complicate matters, we use Git LFS, large file storage. It's a plugin that allows you to put into Git very large files. So we needed that for some of our larger raster images. We also had some CSV files that were excessively large. Git LFS itself is not supported directly by GitHub. So moving to S3 wasn't going to be as simple as downloading the zip file and loading it into an S3 bucket. I'd have to use the git clone command to grab the files, zip them up, and then upload them. And I was pretty sure this was possible from the command line, so I employed my favorite software development skill, which is copy pasting from Stack Overflow. I make use of this a lot. The next natural progression is changing stuff and seeing what happens. Things ultimately go wrong, so Googling the error message usually leads me right back to Stack Overflow, where I copy paste the solution. And that's exactly what happened in this situation.
But you're guaranteed not the only one who that was their workflow.
So what I have is this workspace here.
So this is the workspace that is getting the data in folders for people to use on the training course that lives on a virtual machine?
Well, this is actually one step before that.
Okay.
So that's one of the next
Sorry, I
workspaces
knew
that we
that
look
was
at. So what this one is actually doing is taking what we've been maintaining in GitHub and moving that onto Amazon S3 so that it can be downloaded more often and faster for a lower price.
Perfect.
The creator is what most of my workspaces start with because I never actually have a source data set that's traditionally supported by one of our readers. I make use of attribute managers a lot for conditional values, but also in this case to write the content of a batch file. So this does just a little bit of cleanup on the local machine, deleting what's currently there. This command here is a git lfs clone command. Again, I had to copy paste that from the LFS webpage to figure out how to do that. Once it's all downloaded or cloned onto the local machine, I zip it up. And then this part here I found on Stack Overflow. And this is just a PowerShell command to write a zip file up to a bucket. And I'm reasonably sure none of my actual secret keys are being shown. That's good.
We can edit that out.
So, yep. Not giving away anything too much. So this is the content of the batch file. I then use an attribute file writer to actually create the batch file, and then the system caller to run the batch file. So when I run this, it will clone the data locally and then upload it to S3. So the next trick was to launch that. Which I will get to in just a moment here. So this is all managed in GitHub.
And for anyone who doesn't know, Stack Overflow is a community where developers share their programming
Yes.
and you can borrow it.
Yes.
And build on it.
People post their questions there. And that can be a question about how I do something, or, oh my gosh, I've run into this error message. What do I do? And it's usually the types of error messages you get if you just mindlessly copy paste things over. And they'll point that out to you and show you how to correct for that. So Stack Overflow is a wonderful resource. Whenever I've tried to do stuff, usually like documentation will have information about how things work, but they tend not to have a lot of examples. Stack Overflow tends to have the actual examples. So I've had times where I've started working with the documentation of an SDK and I just don't get it. And then I'll do a search for something that's in the SDK on Stack Overflow, and I'll find here's an actual example of how it works. And it's something which is very close to cut and pasteable. Yeah. And then it's just changing things to see what works. Once I've done that, then the documentation tends to make more sense to me. And then I can go back and better utilize the documentation. So there's often a back and forth between Stack Overflow and the actual product documentation. So this is our GitHub repository for FME data. So we have it all by year here. Now, one of the things that we can do here in GitHub is under settings, there are the webhooks. So whenever something happens, for example, a push, you can issue a REST API call. And FME server supports REST API calls. So as soon as something is pushed, as soon as there's an update in GitHub for FME data, it fires off that workspace, which I've published to FME server. And then it pushes it to S3. So the moment there's an update in GitHub, our data download is updated as well within a few minutes. So this really helps us get things done or make things available immediately.
How did we do that before?
I would have to remember to run it on occasion. This was actually a scheduled task originally. I had it run every morning at 7, so it would be done just in time for a course. But sometimes you want to test things more frequently, but also, occasionally there were times where during a break we've updated some web pages. Everyone, let's take a 10-minute break, and we're going to reboot your machines, because the moment I rebooted a machine, it would start making use of this, which is an automation I'll talk about in just a moment.
I have a request for a Stack Overflow searcher transformer.
I wouldn't mind that. So now that we have an FME data download that's updated automatically, and my team has direct control over the download URL, the next trick is making sure that the FME data on the virtual machines is the current FME data. So on the virtual machines, I added a scheduled task that runs every time the virtual machine starts. This also means that it's run when the machine is rebooted, and this allows me to change things on the VM without actually changing the disk image. And this startup script is also stored in GitHub. Oops, there we are. Whoop. So this is a batch file that's run every time the machine starts. And what we see here is these two commands here. This will update the FME data, which is currently on the virtual machines. And I'm actually presenting from one of those virtual machines right now. If I go into this, go to my C drive here, here's my FME data. And I started up this machine a few days ago, and that's when FME data was updated. So what this does is just call one of my workspaces, the ARIA2C here. This is a data download utility, I guess. So it allows you to download things from the command line, kind of like wget, I think would be the older version of this. So this downloads the results from a workspace, which I'll show in just a moment. The result of that workspace is a text file that contains the current data download location, the current URL. So let's take a look at that workspace, which is this one here.
I love that little annotation.
Got to start somewhere. First time I heard that, I liked it, so I actually add that comment to pretty much all of my creators.
That was great.
Now, this workspace itself was actually inspired by the Fun with Flags exercise, I guess, that we did at the end of our FME World Tour meetings.
Yeah, hopefully some of you guys were there.
Raise your hands if you ever saw the Fun with Flags. So while I was there, the first time I had heard it, I wasn't paying too close of attention, so I actually used the wrong transformer. I'll talk about the right transformer later on. But what they were doing, scraping web pages, seemed like a really good idea to me. So that's what this one does. It just goes to the FME data downloads page, which contains the FME data downloads for every year. But the first entry, and I use regular expressions for this, would contain what I want. Now, I do have some control over the name of my file, so I can just read in the entire web page and then just do a regular expression search to find what matches. So this is actually just looking for anything that has HTTPS, the name of my bucket, the name of the file, and then the year changes every year, .zip. So every time the machines start, it runs this workspace, gets the current FME data download, downloads it, and unzips it. This also means that when we come out with FME data 2019, I don't have to edit anything on the virtual machine. So an entire virtual machine script will automatically deal with the newest version of FME data 2019 when it arrives. And it'll just end up on the training machines. So then all I have to do, then all my time is put into updating FME 2019 as opposed to updating my virtual machine. So that part of it is updated.
I just chatted out the Fun with Flags template for downloading. We had it on the hub.
Now, the editing or parsing HTML using regular expressions, it wasn't until I had done this quite often that I discovered that's not necessarily the greatest of ideas or not considered a fantastic thing to do, but it works just fine, actually, when doing it in FME.
Thanks, Steve. I just chatted out where you can actually play the Fun with Flags game.
Okay, so now the next step was, let me just go back here. So that got the FME data onto the machines. I also needed to get the current FME installer onto the VM. Here at SAFE, we release new builds of FME Desktop and FME Server very frequently. And a common maintenance task for myself on the VMs is downloading and installing the latest versions of FME Desktop and FME Server. A problem I ran into is that every build of FME Desktop and FME Server has a build number in the download URL. That makes the download link unique every single time. But I could use FME to overcome that as well.
Okay, I'm chatting up the latest link to the FME builds.
Mm-hmm.
We do update those a lot.
So here's downloading my new installers. And again, I'm just using my download utility to make a call to an FME workspace, which finds the FME installer list. It downloads that as a text file, and then ARIA2C then downloads those files. Once I have those, I then have these commands here to do a silent install of the installers I've just downloaded. So now to install the latest versions of FME Desktop and FME Server, I just have to run this batch file. Now the workspace for that is very similar to the data download one. So it's this one here.
And we're going to try to share these out after for people as well.
Yes, we'll be making these available once the recording goes up. I just have to go through and make sure that I haven't put in any passwords. Some of the other workspaces do have passwords in them and tokens. I don't want to send those out to everyone. You couldn't do too many horrible things to us, but maybe starting up a lot of machines could happen. So this one here, this is also going through the downloads page, or actually a slightly different page. So this is going to our safe.com/downloads page. I then have a string searcher. Again, this one is searching for two things. The string searcher transform is really handy for looking for text strings. And these regular expressions are just really useful when it all comes down to it. Putting everything in brackets adds it to a list. So quite often, this is followed by a list exploder because it's going to find multiple results. I can explode them, filter out anything which is a beta because I don't want to install that, and then I write that out to the text file. Now also, something I wanted to mention, while putting together these workspaces, this one I only put together this year, and the run with feature caching option really made this a lot easier because I could run to a certain point, and getting the string correct, it takes a lot of time. So I could just make some edits and then just run that part of the translation over and over again, checking my regular expressions, checking the output, seeing if I'm getting what I want. Also, sometimes I'm not entirely sure where what I want is going to show up. For example, in that particular workspace, in the string searcher, we have the first match. Sometimes what I've entered in there will show up there. Sometimes they'll show up in this list, the all matches list name. Sometimes it shows up in the sub-expression instead, because I might have smaller bits. Ultimately, quite often when I'm putting it together, I'm not sure which one those are going to show up in. I just know it's going to be one of them. Yeah. So I can just run run that part of the translation over and over again and inspect what I'm getting, which is the changing stuff and seeing what happens model of software development. So now I've got the installers onto the machine. I've run the installers. I have my disk image. The final problem was creating the virtual machine from the image for the students. When we first started doing this, we would start them manually, and then we'd have to notify the students with connection information. And there was two problems with this. The first is that it took time to start the machines and notify the students. When courses got larger, this means that it could take a full day or more to accomplish that. Basically, it became a full-time job. If a course started on Monday, this means we were starting the machines on Friday or even Thursday of the previous week, and the machines were left running over the weekend, and that cost money. I'm sure it's only 50 cents per hour, but when you have that many hours multiplied by 100 or sometimes 200 students that would sign up for a course, it added up pretty quick. We also often ended up starting machines for students who signed up for the course but weren't planning on actually attending. If we had 200 students signed up for a course, we'd probably only get about 100 of them. We had 100 machines that were never going to be touched. They're going to run for the entire week of the course because you can't really tell if someone's logged in, and that adds up quickly. So I wanted a way to allow students to request the virtual machine themselves and then be given the connection information. Unfortunately, AWS does not offer a straightforward way of doing this. They don't have an interface themselves that would allow people external to SAFE to go in and create a machine. I had heard that the AWS SDK could allow you to programmatically start a virtual machine, and that the SDK in JavaScript or Python could work with AWS Lambda and a web page to allow people to start the virtual machine. But that had a few problems for me. The first is I don't really know any JavaScript. Also, I don't really know any Python. I certainly don't know how to use Lambda, and my skills related to authoring a web page are also really suspect. So my plan was to, again, use my skill of copy pasting from Stack Overflow, and it turns out that FME does work really well with that method.
See, I love that. Use what you have.
Yes. So I quickly chose JavaScript as the scripting language to use with the AWS SDK to launch an EC2 machine. This was not because of any particular research I had done into it. This was because it was the first example I found on Stack Overflow. And it's not the greatest justification, but this method did work really well for several years. So let's take a look at that workspace, which is this one. Nope, not that one.
I love this example though, because it's one of the ones that shows that if you have a goal in mind, you can get there, even if it's not through the perfect means that someone else might do.
I mean, ultimately, I could have done all of this in Node.js. I could have done it all in Python. But there was two possible problems with that. First of all, I don't work with those languages very often, which means while I could bring myself up to speed to be able to do it once, I don't work with those languages in my day-to-day job. And it's a perishable skill. So if I come back to it a year from now without ever using it in that intervening time, the maintenance of it becomes very difficult, and trying to remember how I had things set up. Now, if I was working every day in those programming languages, then it would probably work just fine. But for me, I don't have opportunities to do that.
Yeah, you can sustain it.
So much of this, got to start somewhere. I create a unique ID for a folder location on FME server. I do some things to filter out some weird characters. I no longer actually have to do that. So a lot of this stuff up to here is just about tags. And then just like my S3, my GitHub to S3 workspace, I have an attribute manager here. Instead of creating a batch file, this one's actually creating a JavaScript file. So this is basically what I copy pasted and then expanded on from Stack Overflow. So the first command, it all started with, see, even now I have trouble finding, there we are, run instances. So it all started with that and then worked backwards. So it's not a large piece of JavaScript, but every time I went in to edit this, especially with this little disaster at the end, it was a bit of a house of cards. And I wouldn't be able to expand it in any way which I would want, because I'd have to figure out how that would all work in here. And there was things I was running into, certain problems where this was difficult for me to maintain. Also, ultimately, with this method, I was running another Amazon EC2 instance with FME server on it in order to run this. I didn't like doing that. For one, it was costing us money. So it cost about $2,000 a year just to keep that machine up and running. The second thing is that the version of FME server on it was always a few behind what we were currently using here at Safe. So on my own machine, I would update this workspace, but then I wouldn't necessarily be able to push it to my virtual machine, because it would be the FME server would be an older version. So then I started having to use Workbench on the virtual machine to make sure it was an older version. And working with older versions of FME is painful because there's always new functionality, which is really handy, like run with feature caches, the partial runs. I really wanted to make use of this anytime I was editing the workspace. But if I was running this with FME 2015, which happened at one point, I couldn't do that. So I wanted something where FME server would be updated without me having to do that. So ultimately, I wanted to get all of this onto our instance of FME Cloud. FME Cloud is an FME server installation that's hosted on AWS. We manage it for you, and it will get the regular updates of FME server. So that's where I wanted to go. The problem with FME Cloud is, while it's possible to get Node.js installed in it and all the other little packages that you need to work with the Amazon SDK, it wasn't straightforward to do that, and I wanted to make this workspace also available to our partners. So that necessitated moving to something which would have the appropriate packages already on FME Cloud, and only the Python caller had that. So when I was told I was going to do this webinar, I realized that I'm going to have to share all these workspaces out, and this one would be embarrassing to share. Instead, I would much rather share out one that used the Python caller. It only took about an afternoon to move everything from JavaScript into Python callers in this workspace. Most of this came from the previous workspace. I cleaned it up a little bit to create things like the tags. And then I used the Python caller instead. So this is a Python caller which makes calls using Boto3, which is the Amazon SDK for Python. I then get replies back from the Amazon SDK API in JSON. I use this type of transformer for all of my various calls. And the only thing that changes is this bit right here. Actually, not even that bit. This bit right here. All of this stays the same, and the reply stays the same as well. And then I just use the different calls from the Amazon SDK. In this case, I am describing instances. When a student goes to request a virtual machine through our web page, the first thing we do is check to see if they already have an instance that exists. So that's what this transformer here is doing. It's checking to see if they already have an instance. And then the response comes back as JSON. There's this little bit here. I had run into an error message. I Googled it. And then Stack Overflow provided me with the answer. So I added that to the comment right there to explain why I have this response default string part. So I described the instances. For what I'm doing here with the Amazon AWS SDK calls, it always comes back as JSON. So I flatten that, and then if necessary, explode a list. So these three transformers, this combination is used quite a bit in this workspace.
Choose your own adventure.
Yep. So I then take a look at reservations. Well, the list that I get back. So I've checked our EC2 instances to see if the student already has one. If it doesn't find a match, go create a virtual machine. If it does find a match, let's take a closer look at what the response was. So I grab the IP address. I need that when people are opening up the machines or trying to connect with remote desktop. There's a couple of states the machine could be in. It could be running, it could be pending. Those are good ones. It means that the machine is actually up and running and they can use it. Or it could be stopped. It could be terminated. There's a couple of other weird things that could happen. That is usually bad, and we'd want to create another machine. If it's running or pending, I want those ones to go first, so I hold back any of the other machines. And then I just grab the first one, and then I test the states. If it's running or pending, go make the RDP file and email it. If it's not, now we go up to create the actual instances. So again, we see this Python caller, JSON flattener, and list exploder combination. Again, all of this part of the transformer stays the same. So I duplicate the transformer. I make use of private parameters to store things like the AWS secret key that's stored in a password private parameter. So even if you got this workspace, you couldn't necessarily see what that is. And this is changing this SDK command with its filters. So this is describe images. This takes a look at all of our course types. On all the AMIs, the disk images that I create, I have a tag indicating what that particular image is used for. This searches through all of those and finds the appropriate image, which means that I can use different images for different courses or different purposes. We don't just use these images for training courses. We also use it for our certifications as well. And it's all going through the same page. So we find the disk image, and then I have this Python caller followed by a JSON flattener to actually create the virtual machine. That also applies a bunch of tags. And it brings back some information. One of the things that's missing from that information is the public IP address, what you'll have to use to connect to the virtual machine using remote desktop. So I need to use another Python caller, which is this one here, to get the public IP address. Now this one is in a looping transformer. In all my years at SAFE, this is pretty much the only valid use of a looping transformer I've ever used myself, or to be honest, pretty much seen. With the looping transformers, generally speaking, for most processes that you'd want to do, using lists would work better. I don't use a list in this case because this is an asynchronous API call. We don't know when that public IP address is going to be available. It could be available in a quarter of a second. It could be close to a minute. We don't want to just put a wait in there and wait for a minute, because then that slows down everyone. So what we do here is check for the IP address. If we have it, send the feature out. If we don't, loop it again. I also have a counter on here that increments. So when it loops back, it comes to this entry here. I increment that counter, and if it fails a certain number of times, it goes out through the failed port because something's gone wrong on the Amazon side. And that, if it fails, that's then emailed directly to me to take a closer look at it. Otherwise, it goes down here to create the RDP file. Again, I make use of attribute managers to create the content of the RDP file. The RDP file is just a text file, but it contains the connection information to connect to our remote desktop instances. Most of this here I could actually combine into one transformer with a conditional value, but I'm creating the various RDP files. I write out the RDP files. This bit here is grabbing information from the features because when I write out the files, I lose a lot of attributes. That's actually been updated for FME 2018. Our output ports actually have more information, so I can get my summary attributes, additional summary attributes there. So I don't actually need all of this. I just haven't updated the workspace yet. And then I email with different email messages the students that are taking the training course, the connection information, how to do it, and the RDP files themselves. This also means I don't have to use the email results option for the data download service in FME Server. So I don't actually have to maintain that part on FME Server and make changes there. I can manage that directly within the workspace.
So we may have been a little over ambitious with our time.
Mm-hmm.
We'll go over, and thanks to everyone who stayed with us so far. If you have to jump off, you can catch us on live chat at safe.com, the Knowledge Center, Twitter. We're available in many different places. But if you can't stick around, please do, because we have another cool demo to show you.
Mm-hmm. I guess I needed to talk faster.
Well, we have a lot of ground to cover. Honestly, this is like the first 40-minute webinar we've done. We normally do an hour.
So the workspace which I have, I needed a web page for that, and that is actually managed on GitHub as well. It's this one here. This is actually where I keep all of this configuration. So all of my scripts for creating the machines, as well as the web page itself, are stored here. But I can't host the web page from GitHub. I mean, there's ways I could do that, but we have S3. I might as well do it from there. So I actually push all of this to an S3 bucket. The web page that we use, this interface for FME Server, where you choose your training course, enter your name, enter your password, request a virtual, enter your name, enter your email, request a virtual machine. That's actually all hosted on Amazon S3. So this is the web page itself. It's a static page. So I need to push from S3, from GitHub again onto S3. But again, I wanted that to be managed on FME Cloud instead of a specific machine. So I used a slightly different workspace for this. This is my GitHub to S3 reflector. I can actually use this workspace to move anything from GitHub, any GitHub repository that I want, onto an S3 bucket. So it uses an HTTP caller to use the zip file from GitHub. This is assuming I don't have something with LFS. In this case, it'll work. I then use a zip extractor. This is a custom transformer that unzips a file and stores it in a temporary folder. Thank you very much, Takashi. This was really helpful for me. Again, a string searcher. String searchers are really handy when you're dealing with this. So this is finding the name of the file which I've downloaded and getting the individual files. And then this is combined with an S3 uploader to push it to S3. Now, once I've configured this workspace, I can actually use this with any Git repository I want to push to any of my own Amazon S3 buckets, I don't actually have to come back and edit this in any way, because all of it in my GitHub here is managed through a webhook. So I have my webhook. It's going to make me go through that.
Now the zip extractor, is that a transformer that's only available on the hub?
That's available from the hub, but everyone should have access to that.
Oh.
So if you just type in zip on the canvas, it should bring up your zip extractor option, and then it'll download from the hub and it'll embed it in your workspace.
Perfect.
So here's where I call that particular GitHub to S3 workspace, and then as published parameters, I can just enter in my GitHub zip URL. So anytime there's a push, it will download that, and then I specify my zip bucket, and then I also have a token, which I won't show you, to actually run it. So I can then make use of this webhook in any of my Git repositories to push directly to Amazon S3. And that gives me my web page. So now people can make requests in the Amazon AWS EC2 dashboard. We also get to see all of the virtual machines. We can tell if they're running, so we can find them during the course. Here we can find your IP addresses, the VNC onto your machines, and we can see who took the course as well.
And we don't have to pay to keep machines running.
That's right. So it's all part of this. We're making use of some resources we already have. We have FME Cloud ourselves for the office, so that is a reduced cost. Hosting a static web page on Amazon S3 is very inexpensive, so that's really helpful as well. Okay, now I think the bonus demo. A lot of this also started in a workspace that I created for my own purposes. I like skiing a lot at Sun Peaks. And there's a few hotel properties up there that I'd be interested in buying a place in. The problem right now is that those properties are selling quickly. So by the time I would notice that they're available, they were already sold. The interface here, this would just flood me if I subscribed with all sorts of properties I'm not interested in. I only wanted properties from one of these 5 hotels. I don't like the residences. So I want it from these 5 hotels, but that would mean I'd have to navigate here. Every time I wanted to check, I have to go to this page here and then click here.
And then get your hopes
and then get my hopes dashed because everything's already sold or pending. So what I wanted to do is scrape this page and find something. Well, scrape it. I think I have it on a scheduled task now for every 6 hours. So as soon as it's available, as soon as it's here, I'll be notified.
First to know.
First to know. So here's the workspace I use for that. And this was the first one which I did. Actually, no, I had done a few of my Fun with Flags inspired ones first. And then I actually had to present the Fun with Flags and realized I had done it wrong. So in the Fun with Flags, what it actually uses is not the HTTP caller, but the HTML extractor, which is actually a little friendlier to use. So in this workspace here, I'm creating 5 features because I want to check 5 different hotels. So I have my attribute value mapper here, finding my 5 values. I then extract each of those pages using the HTML extractor. While I was doing this, this was also when the partial runs had just become an option. So I was using this partial run a lot to run it, see what I would get. I can then explode everything out. I do a string searcher to see if something is, here's my listing text. It'll list it. It has that little banner on it that will say if it's sold or pending. I can then filter. I don't care about the sold and pending ones. So I ignore those. The rest of it continues on. I can then go to the details page for everything which is available. So I do another HTML extraction. I then have a string searcher. I mean, this looks complicated, but what you can do is enter in the text string. So I can inspect it, grab what I'm actually seeing on the page, place it in here, and then just start piecing this regular expression together. And I make a lot of uses of these parentheses. These will store things in a list element, the period, the plus, a question mark. So what this will do is it will grab everything up to the next thing which you have, the next thing that you specify. I think this is called a greedy or non-greedy search. I meant to look that up, but it's in the documentation for regular expressions. But this type of thing I use a lot, followed by where I should stop searching. So that allows me to find all the details I want about that particular property. Now, I also don't want to get emailed about the same property over and over again. So I have a SpatialLite database that is kept with my workspace. And it stores everything based on the MLS number, which I've extracted. So I check the database to see if it's already there. If it is there, just end the translation. If it isn't there, write it to the database and then email me the particulars of this particular property. Now, something which I also use during testing here is the SQL executor up here. It's just sort of off by itself. I use this to clean out the database, because with the SQL executor, I can have my SQL statement. When I go into the properties here, I could just run that to clear that particular table. That allowed me to do testing a lot easier. I could clear out that database if necessary. Another really useful transformer when working with the attributes is the logger transformer. When I was working with mapping, map data a lot, I rarely used the logger because I cared about the spatial side of it. The logger allows me to quickly run a translation. I can do the partial run. I don't actually have to inspect it because that takes time. I can just take a look in the log window. And now with this severity here, I can set that to warning. That means that when I run the translation, just run that, when things appear, I can quickly filter just by my warnings, and that'll give me the information that I want. So that's our bonus.
That's awesome. Oh, you'll be skiing in no time.
Yep.
Now, when was the partial run introduced?
The partial run was new for this year. Now, we did have caching for, well, what we call full inspection. So we were able to double click on it and inspect it, but we still had to run the entire translation up to that point in order to get that. The partial runs allowed us to just run that particular transformer or group of transformers quickly and easily, and just make a change to the transformer, run it. With a string searcher, that's really important because the regular expressions, they're tricky. So you're never entirely sure what you're going to get until you run it and take a look at it. So the partial runs are great for that, which also prompted me to push things to the FME cloud installation faster because I wanted to make sure I'm using the latest version of FME server. So once this came out, I'll have to update my FME server installation. It's a whole bunch of work, and it was just painful. So that really made me want to work with FME cloud instead. Now, there were some questions earlier here. Someone asked about you have to create the webhook connection on GitHub. The webhooks which I'm using are on GitHub. I did have other things, like I do have other workspaces that actually also monitor my S3 buckets. So once I push something from GitHub onto S3 and it's there, I then do another translation that does some other things I won't get into. So it's actually using an S3 watcher on FME server itself. So that's another thing which I often make use of.
Well, we didn't go too far over. We made it like maybe about an hour.
Yeah.
15 minutes isn't so bad.
Yeah.
But we can stick around a bit longer for questions if anyone wants to chat those in. I was going to ask Brian, on the last demo that you did, if someone wanted to get an email back containing maybe different information, like if you cared about the number of bedrooms as opposed to like the strata fee, how would they go about changing that?
Well, that's not that hard to do. Let me just find it here. So when I run this, that's all handled in the string searcher here. So what I would end up doing is taking a look at what's before that. So what I am getting is my article here, I believe. It's one of these two. I'd have to double check, but I believe it's the article. So I check all of this. I'd copy that. And in my workspace, go into the string searcher and I have my regular expression here. Let's see if I grab the right one. There. So we can see here how this regular expression is highlighting little bits here. So then it's just taking a look at this. I'd want to expand it a little bit. So it does take a look at, it does mean that you have to take a look at what you're getting back as a response. But I do have things here, like my listing city. And there'd be other information in there as well. Bedrooms, bathrooms. I think this is actually, I think I actually wanted the other one because there is a table that also contains things like the MLS, values and stuff like that. So I think I actually grabbed the wrong one, but you can see.
It would simply be just updating.
Yeah. So it would just be finding that and adding it in here. So this is like grabbing the strata fee and then grabbing the taxes, and then grabbing the MLS. So it's just copying and pasting another little bit here, changing the value that's in there and seeing what it grabs.
That's great.
And then just rename it. So I have all of my parts here. So I'd find which details part it ends up being, give it a new name, and then in the email, it's just grabbing that. So I'd just add a new line here and enter that in.
Very cool. Yeah, I guess that probably about wraps it up. Thanks so much, everyone who's stuck around. And for anyone listening in Canada, I hope you have a good Thanksgiving weekend. And thanks so much, Ryan, for taking the time to show off what you did.
Thank you for putting up with me for an hour.
No, it was great. And if you are interested in getting some of these workspaces, you'll get an email after the webinar with the recording and the slides. And if you click on that, you'll be taken to a web page, and there will be some workspaces that you can download. So thanks again, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.